Hello guys, Baruch Hashem. This is The Great Question with yours truly, Yehonatan. Today I will be interviewing yet another Yehonatan, very rare, Rabbi Yonatan Neril. Rabbi Yehonatan founded and directs the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, which shows the connection between religion and ecology and mobilizes faith communities on behalf of preventing climate change. Rabbi Yehonatan has authored the best-selling book, Eco-Bible, an ecological commentary on the Hebrew Bible. He's a member of the United Nations Environment Faith-Based Advisory Council. He has spoken internationally on religion and the environment at the World Economic Forum in Davos and in other places around the world. He is also a distant relative of mine that I happened to have met yesterday at a dinner party. Thank God for that. I'm looking forward for you guys to see our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Rabbi Yehonatan Neril, the founding director of the Interfaith Center of Sustainable Development. I have his book with him right here. He's got the Eco-Bible, Volume 1, an ecological commentary on Genesis and Exodus. Now, Rabbi, how did you get involved in this topic? Being a rabbi and being conservative, being a religious conservative, would make you seem to be anathema to these things. Why would a religious person care about the environment?
That's the central question that I've devoted my life to in terms of how I got into this. So I grew up with some level of ecological awareness. I grew up on an acre of land in California in a garden that I gardened with my mother and an orchard. And I also grew up with some Jewish background. And when I moved to Israel when I was about 22, I started studying in yeshiva, and I realized that Jewish teachings have deep things to say about ecological sustainability. The rabbis of previous generations many of them were living in pre-modern, pre-industrial situations. Rashi was a vintner. He had his own vineyard. And I just came to see in the text some deep ecological insights from the Maimonides, Rashi, some of the great sages of previous generations. And I took notes, and based on those notes, I then compiled Eco-Bible together with Rabbi Leo D.
So give me like a general sense. What does Judaism have to say about the environment in general?
So there's a lot of different teachings. Eco-Bible is actually an attempt to present 400 of those teachings. It's on 400 different verses. Volume 1 of Eco-Bible is on Genesis and Exodus. Volume 2 is on Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I'll just give you one example. It says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, "And God placed the human being in the Garden of Eden," which Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory translates as, "to serve it and conserve it." And Rabbi Sacks understood that this verse, while it's God speaking to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, it's actually not just directed at them in the Garden of Eden, but it's directed at humanity in all generations, especially ours. That God wants us to take care of God's creation. Otherwise, why would God have created so many species? There's over 10 million species on planet Earth. And my son recently became bar mitzvah in Jerusalem during the Torah portion of Shemini in the book of Leviticus, where it's the Torah portion that speaks about the most on animals and not eating specific animals that are considered impure animals for Jews to eat. And the question arises, if there are only a small number of kosher animal species like cows and chickens and turkeys and goats, why did God create these other 9.999 million species of animals that Jews are forbidden for eating? And so some of the sages, among them Maimonides, explains that God created these species because God desires for them to exist. They have their own purpose, but their purpose is not to give pleasure for Jewish consumption. Rather, they have other purposes that perhaps are even beyond us. But as one of the verses says, Hashem, how great are your works, O God, all of them you created with wisdom.
From the Jewish perspective, what's the purpose of nature in general? Is it human-centric, or is it God-centric, or is it an end in of itself?
Rabbi Moshe, the Ramchal, taught that God's desire is to do good to creation. And so therefore, when God created the world, God sought to do good. I don't think it's about an anthropocentric view. It's not just about them providing benefit to people, because the truth is that humans actually have not even experienced many of the species here. There are millions of species of beetles that almost all people don't encounter, that are beyond us. And it seems to be that God has created a web of life on this planet, which is the only planet that we know that has life in the whole universe. And because God wants to do good. And so the life existing is part of God's plan. And so therefore it's incumbent upon us at the top of the food chain to maintain the web of life and not to degrade it.
How can life be only good and create all his works? And I think it's so beautiful what you're saying. How can it all be good if, there is all this? It's like one of these questions about life in general. Why does suffering happen to animals?
It's interesting because if you look at the first chapter of Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, God says to people, eat plants. The next verse 30, God says to animals, eat plants. The next verse 31, God saw all that God created and it was very good. Now, what was Tov Ma'od? What was very good? On the simple reading, to me it seems that life did not take life to sustain life. God had a vision for the earth of where all the animals and the insects and the birds and the fish subsisted off of the plants, the vegetative matter that took the photosynthesis energy from the sun and converted it into energy. And so therefore, what was very good was that it was actually a world without much suffering, that there wasn't killing of life in order to sustain life. The people were picking the fruit from the tree. They were reaching up toward heaven, and they were picking the fruit, and they were taking in the fruit, and the tree wanted to give its fruit because then people helped to disperse the seeds. And it was a very good world. And according to Chief Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, who was the first chief rabbi in pre-state Israel, he says that vision of God that God spells out in several verses in the first chapter of Genesis, that's not just a stum vision that was lost. It's not like a vision that we lost after the flood with Noah and that we'll never return to. Rav Kook taught that's actually a vision that we can return to. He wrote that in 1903, and according to a lot of rabbis today, the time has come, higi azman, to return to such a vision.
Can you tell us a little bit about Judaism and veganism and Israel?
Sure. So Tel Aviv is actually a vegan capital of the world. It has some of the highest per capita vegan people in the world.
I've heard it's the highest.
Yeah, it definitely could be. And there's a number of rabbis, among them Chief Rabbi David Rosen, former Chief Rabbi of Ireland and the former rabbi of the largest synagogue in South Africa, who believe that it's so easy to eat a vegan diet today that there's no reason not to, especially in light of the harm that the raising of animals does to those animals and it does to our climate from the release of methane. And so there's over 100 rabbis who have actually signed on to a statement that say that in order to truly fulfill the Jewish principle of tsar balei chayim, of not causing pain to animals, that we should switch to a plant-based diet, which with Impossible Burger, etc., is actually essentially tastes the same as a meat-based diet.
In the past, in biblical times, we didn't have factory farming. I've seen pictures and videos of slaughterhouses. It looks like Auschwitz. It seriously does. It looks like a concentration camp. How do you think we get from a mainly meat-eating paradigm to a vegan or vegetarian paradigm that's more in line with your version of Jewish values?
I think part of it is if we can witness the situation as it exists today. So sometimes I go on hiking tours outside of Jerusalem with groups. We'll pass a chicken shed and we'll just get to look at the chickens in the cages, see how they live. It's not a pretty sight. It's actually, for me, a religious experience because I look at it and I say, wow, this is exactly not what God wants. This is lo tov mode, lo tov, not good. But I think part of it also has to do with rabbinic leadership. I think it's important that rabbis talk about this issue. It's a little bit of a sacred cow. It's a little bit of an untouched topic because a lot of people don't want to hear it. But part of the work that I'm doing in my organizations and in the Jewish Eco Seminars branch of my organization is to encourage rabbis to teach and preach about these issues.
Is it the conditions with which these animals are being slaughtered that makes it lo tov? Or is it the fact they're being slaughtered at all?
It's all of the above. In a world where life does not take life to sustain life, so there's no killing that's involved. And because to kill another being for our food is not ideal. That's in Genesis chapter 1, makes that clear. Now, it would be one thing if it was just the...
What does it say?
It's where it says that God says for people to eat plants.
Okay.
Now, the kosher slaughter would be one thing, but the main issue from my perspective is actually the way the animals live. And they're not, for the most part, in pasture. They're inside in what are called concentrated animal feeding operations. And that's not the way that God created the world to be.
So I've got some questions regarding your book. How can one be a conservative or a religious conservative and also be pro-environment?
It used to be that conservatives were pro-environment. Time of Richard Nixon, for example. And indeed, the word conservative contains the word conserve. To conserve means make sure that what is today will exist for the future. And for whatever reasons, that's changed. In my personal life, I pray 3 times a day. I dress modestly, try to maintain a religious lifestyle based on Jewish teachings. And there's no contradiction between that and also enjoying walking in nature, caring for animals, ensuring that the next generation inherits a livable, thriving, and spiritually aware planet. It's not a contradiction. The only contradiction is in our minds, that it's got politicized, that caring for God's creation is a liberal issue. It is a left-wing issue. And maybe that's because the environmental movement arose in the 1960s at the same time as the hippie movement and the free love movement. And so I think a lot of religious people conflated those different movements and said, oh, so the environmentalists are also the free love people. And some of them were, but some of them were not. And so what I'm part of is a global faith-based ecological movement that involves Jews as well as Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists. And we're finding common cause in seeing that we can protect creation as a religious principle.
Can you tell me an instance of Jewish leadership in that setting when you're working with other faiths? How do you stand out as who you are?
Jews have a special role to play in the world. There are only 15 million Jews in the world, tiny percent of the population, but Jews are also inheritors of an ancient religious tradition from the ancient Israelites. And we're, as one of my teachers, Rabbi Sutton, said, we're living in times that our ancestors have been dreaming about for thousands of years. The glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, the deserts are expanding, the rainforests are burning. At this moment in history, God is calling on us to elevate the teachings in our faiths that relate to ecological sustainability in order that we can preserve God's creation. This is the call of the hour.
As I've seen in my personal life, I've become blasé about the environment. How do you stimulate sensitivity within somebody?
That's part of the work of Eco-Bible. Some Jews read it based on the Torah portion. So each week they take 10 pages of the book and read 10 different commentaries. That's one way to sensitize oneself, is just to make it a weekly learning endeavor. Another way is we also offer a range of videos and other learning resources on this topic. And it's not just me. There are dozens of rabbis who are teaching and speaking about this issue. Over the past several decades, this whole Jewish environmental movement has arisen, and also within other faiths.
Yeah, I think we need to find ways to come together in person and share our hearts with each other and to hear people who are really sensitive. You always put down people that are sensitive in favor for those who are industrious or who are forceful.
I like the way that you're using the word sensitive, because I don't even like to use the word environmentalist or even environmental or environment, because that implies this sort of thing out there in nature that is separate from us, that we need to care for with legislation and whatnot, and which people compartmentalize in their mind and associate it with whatever they associate it, for good or for bad. But you're using the word sensitive. And that, I think, is actually a great way to characterize it, because I also find this among many religious people, that they're sensitive to God's presence. They have a spiritual practice, whether it's prayer or meditation or sacred study, and they're sensitive to God's presence. And in that sensitivity, they are also sensitive to animals and to how animals feel, and to the trees and to the soil and the water and the air. It's not that they're making an idol out of these things. They're not bowing down to the rivers or the trees. No, it's an awareness that, oh, wow, God created all of this. And I can be sensitive to it because this is God's creation and it's so beautiful. So why should I live in a way that degrades it? I should live in a way that protects it.
The environmental movement can actually be deeply anti-human. So how do you fight against that? Humans have a place too.
I think part of the reason why some people in the environmental movement might demonize the human being is because they're demonizing a human being who is destroying God's creation. And so in that view of the human being, it's like someone who's like a pillager or a rapist or some terrible person that is unrefined and living at a low level of spiritual awareness. But on the other hand, if we can live as spiritual, sustainable people, we should celebrate that. That's something to celebrate. Some people in the environmental movement, they don't want to bring children into the world. What does it mean to bring children into the world? As my wife and I have done, we have 2 children that live in Jerusalem. It actually means to take responsibility. It means to say, what type of world am I leaving for my children?
You have a stake.
Yeah.
People that are anti-human environmentalists, they have a really good reason. They see human beings that are acting like brutes, that are destroying the earth, and they are saying, no, I've had enough of this. This is so unjust, and I need to fight against this.
Yeah, and that also relates to the question of how do we approach the issues we're dealing with? Some people go from being deniers to despairers in one fell swoop. In one moment, they deny that there's even an ecological crisis. And then in the next moment, they say, actually, there's nothing we can do about it. The crisis is so bad, there's nothing we can do. And that's actually, I think, one of the deep contributions that religion can bring to the table is giving us a sense of hope. And it's something that Chief Rabbi Yonatan Sachs of blessed memory spoke a lot about as hope as a religious value, based in part on Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who said, don't give up hope. Because we don't know what the future will be. We don't know how bad the problem is, but to despair of it, just give up hope. That's a dangerous place because then it means we don't do anything about it. And there is certainly a good possibility that we can do something about it. And I also believe that if we make the spiritual tikkun, the repair that we need to make, that God will then follow suit and meet us where we're at. Because the root issues of the crisis are greed, arrogance, apathy, short-term thinking, lack of responsibility. And the root solutions are humility, long-term thinking, caring for other people, and caring for other creatures. And these root spiritual solutions are ones that only religion can deliver. It's not going to come from business or politics or science. These are spiritual solutions.
Part of my channel is about helping people become more spiritual. And even though I'm Jewish, I see there's a value to all kinds of spirituality. Do you think that's a bad thing for a Jew to say, if you're a Christian, be a Christian. If you're a Muslim, be a Muslim. If you're a Hindu, be a Hindu. We all believe in one God at the end of the day.
No, Maimonides spoke about how the rise of the spread of Islam in the world in his time 1,000 years ago, that it was a positive development. And I do believe, yeah, whatever religion a person's born into, they should try to be as true to that as possible. Judaism's a non-proselytizing religion. And I also believe that in light of our ecological crisis, religious people should not try to proselytize towards others, and instead should just focus on being good and true and devoted in their own religion. And because we're facing a crisis of where there's ascendant a consumer society, which is delivering a pleasure to people and providing physical pleasure. Now, spirituality has the ability to deliver spiritual pleasure, to experience the love and closeness with, the one living God. And by connecting in a spiritual path, people can be less interested in the physical pleasures, whether it's a hamburger or another movie or whatever it might be.
How does one transcend their appetites?
The mystical Jewish tradition speaks about the human being having 5 levels of soul. And within those 5 levels of soul, there's actually 5 levels, so a total of 25 levels. At the lowest level, which is called nefesh, a person will be attracted to the advertisements that we see on Broadway Street in New York City of whether it's a donut or a pizza, whatever. because the soul at that most physical level is just seeking physical pleasure. However, when we raise our level of soul awareness, those physical pleasures become much less attractive, whereas spiritual pleasures become more attractive. So then the question is, so how do we raise our level of soul awareness? And there's different techniques for doing that. So one technique is prayer. Another technique is Torah study or study of sacred texts. Another technique is to walk in nature and to witness God's creation and the beauty.
Would you say if you're Muslim, it would be to study the Quran, or if we were Christian, to study the Bible?
Yeah, the Christian Bible. Yeah, those are paths for, because look, there's 2.2 billion Christians in the world. There's 1.8 billion Muslims. And we're reaching a point where we need to focus on living sustainably and going deep into our religious traditions. And my hope is that whatever religion a person is, they can go deep into their own tradition for these spiritual and sustainability guidance.
I think that's great. That's really powerful. Now, about your chapters, you have an idea about shepherd consciousness. What is shepherd consciousness?
It's actually a commentary in Eco Bible by Rabbi Feivel Yedidia Glasser, and it's based on some teachings of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook. Some of the patriarchs and the matriarchs were shepherds, and to be a shepherd meant to walk with one's flock of sheep and goats in the hill country of the land of Israel, and to be at one with God. It wasn't sitting in an office and writing emails all day or sitting in a factory and producing something. It was tending the flock and having the time and the space to commune with God. So in our times, there's very few Jewish shepherds in the world. And there's even fewer shepherds than there used to be for various reasons. But we can still take on practices that help us to inculcate that shepherd consciousness. And Rabbi Nachman of Breslov talked about hitbodedut, which is going into nature, going to a forest or a nature area for 1 hour a day. Or if a person doesn't have 1 hour, for half an hour or 10 minutes. And to just walk and speak to God. We're living in this world that is shifting so rapidly. It's the MTV ADD generation, and it's even getting worse now with smartphones, etc. And so to be able to put away our technology and to just go out into a forest and to speak with God, that's a deep spiritual practice.
You talked about the lion consciousness. What is the purpose of predators?
Predators are important. They are key to the food chain, whether it's lions or wolves. And the Bible talks about these predators because they existed in the land of Israel before they were extincted in the past number of centuries. One example is if you look at Yellowstone National Park, when they reintroduced wolves a number of years ago, the wolves actually had a very positive effect on the ecosystem. Because prior to that, there were deer that didn't have a predator that would kill the deer. And so the deer were overgrazing. But when they reintroduced the wolves consumed the deer. But more than that, the wolves forced the deer from congregating in certain river valleys and instead going on higher ground. And that meant that the river valleys then had more trees that grew, and the trees then retained the soil, and that then changed the course of the rivers. So the wolves actually had an effect in changing the course of the rivers.
Who do you think are the predators of human society, and what's their function?
The biggest predator of people over history has been the mosquito. That's been the number one predator. If I remember correctly, about half of the people who have died, it's been because of diseases that have been borne by mosquitoes, whether that's malaria or dengue fever, yellow fever, etc. And in our times, where obviously we have the coronavirus pandemic, which is not spread by mosquitoes, but there's a teaching in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 28, that God created the human being in the image and likeness of God, and God then said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and have dominion." And the rabbis of the Midrash teach that having dominion over creation, or stewardship, or having the right to care for creation, depends on our acting in the image and likeness of God. They say that if we act in the image and likeness of God, we are given dominion, but if we do not, then we are taken down and the animals rule over us.
Talk about your experiences working in the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. Just some stories, anything juicy.
One of the experiences I have is to be able to see that the other is a brother of a different mother, sister of a different mister. It's not about us versus them. It's about us and them and how we can find common cause in protecting God's creation. So I do work with swamis and Buddhist monks and Christian priests and pastors and rabbis and imams. And what's amazing is that people think that these different religious people, how could they get along with each other? They're so different, and there's all these religious conflicts in the world. But actually, when we come together around the topic of environmental sustainability, we find that we can find common cause. And so I'm based in Jerusalem, and I do work there in a city that, is frequently beset by violence. And at the same time, I work with Christians and Muslims and Jews in coming together around clean air, clean water, a stable climate, a healthy Jerusalem.
What's your religious journey, and how did that intertwine with your environmentalism throughout your life? You said you grew up on an acre of land.
Yeah, I went through a process. First of all, my grandmother grew up religious in Chicago in the early 1900s. And her grandfather, who was a rabbi from Vilna, taught her Torah every Shabbat. So she received a transmission of Jewish tradition from her grandfather, who came from the old country. And she then transmitted it to my mother and her other children and to me and my siblings. This deeply held belief that Judaism and God and Torah are central and they're the most important things. Now, I grew up in suburban California, so I didn't take it hook, line, and sinker when I was a kid. But when I was becoming older, when I was a teenager, I had some religious experiences myself. And during college, I was in situations that were essentially near-death experiences where people around me died. And I saw, wow, this life is precious. Life is special. We need to preserve life. I also had this thought when I was a boy or a teenager that if I don't develop myself spiritually, then I'll be missing out on something if I neglect that in my life. In college, I started to become more observant and then moved to Israel when I was 22, and then my wife a few years later, and the rest is history.
I wish my journey was like that. Yeah, I'm 30, not married.
You're still a relatively young man, and I bless you to find the right person.
Thank you, Rabbi. I just opened it up to this portion of the book. Mana and food waste. What happens when you don't eat what you had on the plate, or when you waste food in general?
Yeah, so food waste is another Jewish principle. And thanks for asking these questions, because you're helping to bring out how these ecological behaviors are also Jewish behaviors. One of the commandments in the Torah is not to waste or destroy. It's learned from a verse in Genesis, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 19, where God says not to cut down fruit trees in war when an Israelite army lays siege to a city. And the rabbis of the Talmud understand that verse to be a much broader principle. It's not just about wasting fruit trees in a war, but it's about not destroying anything of value to people at any time, whether it's water or food or clothing, etc. And so the wasting of food, according to almost all rabbinic opinions, is one of the Torah commandments, one of the 613 commandments. And it applies especially today, because in modern society, there's wasting of about a third of the food that is produced. It's a huge amount of food in all the different aspects, whether it's on the farm or in transit or at the store or in a person's fridge or on a plate. And so therefore, it's a Jewish spiritual principle to live a lifestyle that minimizes food waste. It's about spiritual sustainability as one act of where reducing food waste, caring for animals, composting, being mindful of one's carbon footprint, caring for other people in need. All of these are spiritual sustainable principles that are one and the same.
It's powerful. Okay, here's one. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand. So what does that mean to you in terms of environmentalism here?
So Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who was one of the preeminent rabbis over the past 1,000 years and of all times, explains that this means that the person who causes physical damage to another must pay the market value of an eye, a tooth, or a hand, etc. It's not a a physical eye for an eye, because as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye would make everyone blind. So the rabbis of the Talmud understood that it means to pay damages. And in Eco-Bible, Rabbi Leo D. and I relate to how calculating costs of damage done to nature and people is something that economists struggle with to this day. Environmental economists call nature's processes ecosystem services. In other words, the way that, the trees filter water. And a study by the World Wildlife Fund valued them at $125 trillion per year. So in terms of valuing crops, producing solar energy, reducing home heating costs from the shade of trees, etc. And so that's an example of how we're thinking about this principle of the value of an eye and then the value of nature.
Right. So how do we give back? How do we atone for the carbon that we put out into the world?
Yeah, and that's about long-term thinking. The rabbis say, Ezehu Chacham, who is the wise person? The person who sees the long-term effect of their action. When we burn carbon, that stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. And it is inconceivable, perhaps at a low level of soul awareness, to think about our actions in terms of how is this going to affect my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren, 4 generations. But at a higher level of consciousness, that's possible. And so that's why the ecological crisis is really messaging to us to raise our level of soul awareness. Because when we raise our level of soul awareness, Rav Kook teaches that we're also going to raise the level of soul awareness of animals, that they will have an elevation as well. It's uplifting people. And so my previous book that I wrote together with Ivan Marzuk of Konfei Nesharim is called Uplifting People and Planet. How do we uplift people? And that goes back to this idea of, with the environmental movement, if it's all about gloom and doom, it's not gonna capture people. People don't want gloom and doom. But if it's about a spiritual vision for a sustainable planet, that can have some traction.
People can say, oh, I like the spiritual aspects of the Torah, but I don't really like the idea of praying 3 times a day. How do you get people to embrace the whole vision of the religion?
Judaism is a very ambitious religion because there are so many commandments that it's actually a challenge. Even for somebody might be very diligent about praying 3 times a day, but they might be less mindful in terms of their food waste, for example. It's really just about being our best selves. How do we be our best selves? How do we take on what we can in a sustainable way? What's key in our time is to wake up to the palace on fire, to God's creation on fire, while we still have time. As Hillel the Elder said, if not now, when?
We solve our politics by becoming more spiritual, right? More spiritually sensitive and responsible. So in that vein, what message would you say to our audience?
So in the vein of responsibility, I would just end with a short story that the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison told when she received the Nobel Prize for Literature in Stockholm. She told the story of a young boy who came up to an elder woman with a bird in his hands. And he said to the elder woman, "Can you tell me whether the bird in my hands is alive or dead?" And she realized that the boy was playing a trick on her. Because if she said the bird was dead, he would open his hands and the bird would fly away and she would be wrong. If she said the bird was alive, he would close his hands and crush the bird and she would also be wrong. He had her coming and going. And so she thought to herself for a minute and she looked at the boy in the eyes and said, "I don't know whether the bird in your hands is alive or dead. All I know is that the life of the bird is in your hands." And that's true of each of us. We are living in a pregnant, evolutionary moment in spiritual history that is calling on us to have a spiritual evolution toward a worldview of interdependence, interconnection, interbeing. And the more that we can embrace that, the more that we can enable the next generation to inherit a thriving, sustainable, and spiritually aware planet. That's my blessing to us today. And thank you so much for joining us in this.
Thank you. This has been The Great Question with Yehonatan, with 2 Yehonatans. I've been here with Rabbi Yehonatan Neril. It's been an absolute honor and privilege. Thank you so much for coming.
Maybe you'd just like to give him the opportunity to plug his socials.
Yeah, do you have a social media you'd like to to plug? Or
Yeah, so we're active on Facebook and YouTube. We actually have the largest YouTube video collection on religion and ecology.
Oh, okay. I would have remiss to not mention that. Okay, so we'll have the link. We'll have the link in the description, and we'll organize that. So
Amazing. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you.
Environmental justice. Environmental justice. Environmental justice. Let's bring hope back into the world. Environmental justice, boys and girls. Let's do this together. Let's become better. Animal to spiritual, we will go higher and higher. Cousin Yehonatan, my name is also Yehonatan. We're so happy to be together with my friend Jason. We're doing it, yes, yes. Spreading social consciousness. We're doing it together. Hopefully doing it forever.
Sometimes people ask me, how could it be that you speak about religion and ecology? Where is the connection between the two? And I say to them, it's really one. It's not about two, it's about one. It's about interconnection, interbeing, interdependence. You see, God created the world and wants to do good to God's creations, to manifest a living, thriving, and spiritual world.
Do good to God's creations, do good to God's creations, do good to God's creation, do good to God's creation.
How could it be that a person can be both religious and ecologically minded in this world of duality where we think that you have to be one or the other, but actually there's a middle path, which is the path of Maimonides, to both care for creation and to seek a religious lifestyle, not to have a dual personality, to integrate the two. It's integration of the religious aspect with the ecological aspect in spiritual sustainability for all of humanity, and taking into account all the species, all 10 million species that God created here in this world. How do we reveal this consciousness? How do we connect one side of our brain with the other? How do we find this middle path? Well, it comes back to the Bible, to the Torah, which is why I was working on an Eco-Bible commentary that I published together with Rabbi Rabbi. We all are one human and earth family, living together, trying to live happily and sustainably here.
Happily and sustainably. Live 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 happily and sustainably.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1981 stood on Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and he called on his devotees to get off of Middle Eastern oil, which he says was not doing good for the human family. And he talked about taking in the sunlight, using solar energy as a way of taking in the bounty of God. He said that it would be plainly ungrateful to God to not use the abundant energy that God has given us from the sun.
Lubavitcher Rebbe, solar energy, Lubavitcher, Rabbi, solar energy, Rabbi, energy, Rabbi, energy, Rabbi, energy, Rabbi, energy, Rabbi, energy, people, energy, come together, energy, 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 let's do it.
Because the energy from the fossil fuels is old energy. It's been trapped for hundreds of millions of years. It's dark energy. But the energy of the sun is fresh energy. It's light energy. God is providing it every moment, and we can translate that to power our economy instead of polluting the earth unnecessarily.
Yeah! Yeah! Woo! All right! Okay, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Good stuff, good stuff.